part of the reason that the Passion story is memorable and compels attention is because it's the ultimate exemplar of a certain kind of story. Now, you might be able to produce another exemplar, and other religious systems have, but it's the ultimate exemplar of a particular story. And then the question is, well, what's the story? And the story is the story of unjust tragedy, right? And it's the ultimate exemplar of unjust suffering and unjust tragedy, because the formal structure of the story is that the worst thing imaginable happens to the best possible person, right? That's the basic story. Now, I don't care if you believe that story. That has nothing to do with what I'm saying. I'm trying to outline, for example, why people have been obsessed with this story for 2,000 years. In that case, we can outline that completely independently of any religious claim. I'm just talking about what the story's about. So it's definitely a tragedy, obviously, because it involves, what does it involve? Torture and death at the hand of the mob and the tyrant. Okay, so that's bad. And also emerging as a consequence of betrayal, and not just betrayal, but betrayal of the closest person, right, the best friend. And then that's all pretty bad. Torture, mob, tyrant, betrayal. That's a lot of bad things. But then it's made worse by the fact that the person who's being judged by the crowd and treated worse than a criminal, in fact despised in comparison to those known to be criminal, was also a person who only did what was best all the time, and everyone knew it, including the people who tried to kill him. So you see, you can't make something up that's more tragic than that, because, well, where do you go? It's like, you're kind of out of tragedies at that point, right? Betrayal, that's bad, that's bad. Dante put betrayers, when he wrote the Inferno, he put betrayers in the lowest circle of hell, right next to Satan himself. And Dante's Inferno is a study of the layers of evil. That's a good way of thinking about it. So it's an architecture of hell. And you might say, well, I don't believe in hell. It's like, well, that's just because you haven't been there. You know, you'd believe in it if you'd been there. And it also means that you just don't understand, because it's Dante's book in particular is the architecture of evil. He was trying to understand how you rank order what's worst. And he put betrayers pretty much at the base. And I think the reason for that is if you betray yourself or if you're betrayed by someone else, it takes your faith away. You know, imagine you're married to someone, you find out, we've been married 10 years, you think you're happy, you think you know what happened in the past, and then you find out the person had sequential affairs and you didn't know about it. It's like, well, then where are you? And the answer is, well, you're lost. And it's so interesting to be lost like that, because you're not only lost in the present, because your present is not what you thought it was. You're lost in the future because you thought you were with someone and doing something that you're not doing, and whatever you thought was going to happen in the future isn't going to happen. And that's pretty bad, because you lose the present and the future. But that isn't all you lose. You also lose the past. And that's pretty damn strange, because you think, well, the past already happened. It's like, not the way you thought it did, buddy. Right? And that's pretty destabilizing. And so betrayal, and then it's worse. Betrayal is actually worse than that, because it doesn't just rob you of the past and the present and the future. It also forces you to suffer for doing something that was actually good. Because it's good to trust someone. If you're naive, that's not so good. But if you are courageous and you trust someone, you extend out their hand and you make them a negotiated arrangement, which is essentially what a marriage is, then you're kind of inviting them to be the best person they can possibly be. And if you don't have that trust, then you can't even get a relationship off the ground. And so then the person who's betrayed you has used your best impulse to do the worst possible thing to you. And so that's pretty damn rough. And a lot of people with post-traumatic stress disorder have PTSD because they've been betrayed, often because they've betrayed themselves, by the way, because you can betray yourself. And so, well, so that's just unpacking part of that catastrophic, tragic story. Betrayal is only part of it, of course. Christ is put to death by the Romans in some real sense, but also by his own people. And so he suffers at the hands of a tyrant, and the tyrant who's the agent of his death is also a moral relativist who asks what truth means, and the crowd is offered the opportunity to allow Christ to escape from death, and they choose a criminal instead. And so what's happened is that all the terrible things that could happen to you in life are stacked up in this story. And then it's pushed to its limit. And so that's extremely interesting. And so it's a very, very dark story. And so then what you think, well, what do people do? What are people doing when they hear that story? Or even more to the point, what are they doing when they go on a pilgrimage, which you could do if you just went to a church, especially a Catholic church, because the Catholics do this particularly, and you walk the Stations of the Cross, or you contemplate the Stations of the Cross. What are you doing exactly? Well, you might ask yourself, what are you doing when you go see a horror movie? And that's a really good question, because it's so preposterous that you would go see a horror movie. It's like you'll do that voluntarily, you'll line up to do it, and you'll pay for it. Why? So you can be disgusted and terrified. It's like, what the hell's wrong with you? Well, seriously, like, what are you up to? And the answer is, you're facing what's disgusting and terrifying. And you're doing it voluntarily. That's what you're doing. And you have an instinct to do that, and that instinct is so powerful that it'll compel you to do that so powerfully that if you do it voluntarily, it's even entertaining, right? You'll do it voluntarily, you'll pay for it. And that's not so preposterous, because one of the things that psychotherapists have learned in the last 100 years, regardless of school, is that if you sit with someone and you find out what they're afraid of and what they're avoiding, and it's a good combination of those two things, because there's things to be afraid of properly, and there's things to be afraid of improperly, and it's improper to be afraid of those things that you have to face in order to move uphill, right? And so therapists have learned that if you get people to face what they're afraid of and avoiding voluntarily, that they get better. And you might say, well, that's because they get less afraid. But that actually isn't what happens. That's not exactly what happens. They get braver instead. It isn't that they get less afraid, and they're not just less afraid of what they're now exposing themselves to. If you treat someone who's agoraphobic, who can't get in elevators, let's say, and you help them learn to confront the elevator step by step until they can finally get in and ride it again, then they start doing things all over in their life that they were afraid to do previously. It generalizes. So if you watch yourself move towards something that's frightening successfully, then you start to understand there's more to you than you thought. And there is more to you, because you've actually learned something when you confront this thing you're afraid of. And then you're more likely to do the same thing in other situations. And that's a good thing to know too, because one of the things you might ask yourself is, how do I improve my life? And one answer would be, well, are there things that you know you need to do that you're avoiding? And the answer to that's almost invariably yes. And then the pathway to your redemption would be, well, you have to start doing those things. And you might say, well, I can't because I'm too afraid. And then a behavioral psychologist would say, well, then just break the thing that you're afraid of down into smaller pieces, and until you can find a piece that's small enough so you'll do it, and then start doing that. And you might think, well, that's a pretty little thing that I have to do to move forward. And the proper response to that is, it doesn't really matter if it's a little thing. What matters is that you confront something that you're afraid of voluntarily. That's what matters. And so then you might say, well, what are people doing when they go to Jerusalem to walk the Via Dolorosa? And what they're doing is they're trying to imagine how to confront the catastrophic suffering of life voluntarily. And they're participating in this story the same way you might participate in a movie. And you might think, that's actually pretty smart. And then you might think, well, what does that story of unjust suffering have to do with me? I don't mean me personally, I mean